The real reason Thomas needed to touch me. The world remembers Thomas as doubting Thomas. They reduce his legacy to a single moment of skepticism, failing to grasp the profound essential role his doubt played in securing the absolute physical truth of my resurrection for all generations that followed. Thomas's demand for physical proof was not a weakness of faith. It was, paradoxically, the final necessary verification of the bodily reality of my victory over death. The real reason Thomas needed to touch me was not for his own sake alone, but for the sake of every believer who would ever be asked to trust in what they could not see. Before the cross, Thomas was a man of fierce, if slightly pessimistic, loyalty. When I decided to return to Judea, knowing full well the danger posed by those who sought my life, it was Thomas who stepped forward and said to the other disciples, "Let us also go, that we may die with him." John 11:16. This was not the statement of a coward, but of a deeply committed man whose loyalty was rooted in tangible reality and shared experience. His faith was not based on abstract theory. It was based on what he could walk alongside and observe. When I appeared to the 10 disciples in the upper room on that first resurrection evening, Thomas was simply not there. This absence, seemingly accidental, was orchestrated by the Father's sovereign plan. The church needed one man to articulate the demand for physical evidence, thereby establishing an unbreakable standard of truth. When the 10 disciples, bursting with joy, told Thomas, "We have seen the Lord," he rejected their testimony with the definitive, non-negotiable terms of a mind fixed on the concrete. "Unless I see in his hands the print of the nails, and put my finger into the print of the nails, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe." John 20:25. This demand was the culmination of his life's philosophy: I will only trust what I can verify. This statement, which sounds like doubt, was actually a declaration of loyal materialism. The doubt of Thomas was not a spiritual failing, it was a demand for certainty in the face of the impossible. His mind was struggling with 3 monumental internal barriers. The reality of death. Thomas had seen me die. He had seen the spear wound. He knew the finality of crucifixion. To him, the idea of a spiritual resurrection was perhaps plausible, but the idea of a bodily, physically scarred return was a violation of the known laws of the physical universe. He was a realist fighting a supernatural truth. The fear of hallucination. Thomas knew the disciples were emotionally fragile, reeling from betrayal and grief. He feared they had seen a ghost, a vision, or a collective psychological event. He needed proof that the person standing before them was the very physical body that had suffered on Calvary, ensuring the resurrection was a historical event, not a spiritual metaphor. The necessity of the scars. His demand to touch the wounds was not malicious, it was profound. He needed proof that the resurrected body was not a new, perfect body, but the same body that had made the atonement. The scars were the signature of the sacrifice. Without the wounds, the connection to the cross was severed, and the redemptive act was incomplete. My first appearance to the 10 established the fact of the resurrection. My second appearance 8 days later was staged solely to satisfy the demand of the one who was absent, thereby securing the quality of the evidence. Are you someone whose faith falters when you encounter the impossibility of the supernatural? Do you demand proof and evidence before you can fully commit? Thomas's story is your assurance. If his quest for certainty resonates with your deepest struggles, I invite you to subscribe now. Let us move beyond doubt into the power of physical proof. 8 days later, the disciples were again gathered, and this time, Thomas was with them. The doors were locked, a sign of their lingering fear. Suddenly, I stood among them and said, "Peace to you." Ignoring all the others, I went straight to Thomas, demonstrating that I had heard every word of his skeptical demand. My response was tailored precisely to his exacting terms. Reach your finger here and look at my hands, and reach your hand here and put it into my side. Do not be unbelieving but believing. John 20:27. This was the ultimate act of grace. I submitted my divine resurrected body to the scrutiny of human skepticism. The real reason Thomas needed to touch me was so that my physical reality would become an objective, verifiable cornerstone of Christian truth. I granted him access to the evidence he needed to testify to the world that the body was real. The resurrected body was physical, tangible, and not a ghost. This refuted the heresy that would later claim my body was an illusion. The death was real. The visible, tangible wounds proved my death was not a swoon or a trick. The nails and the spear had truly done their work. The sacrifice was complete. The same Jesus, the continued presence of the scars, proved that the one who died was the one who was raised. The identity was continuous and undeniable. Thomas, confronted by the reality of the resurrected Christ, who knew his thoughts and his specific private demand, collapsed not into a scientific experiment, but into an act of profound worship. He did not need to touch the wounds after all. The evidence of my knowledge was greater than the evidence of his touch. His cry became the final, definitive creed of the early church: "My Lord and my God." The wounds were the ultimate proof of my resurrection. They were not left on my body as a flaw, but as a seal of redemption. They served three eternal purposes. A witness to humanity, they prove the reality of my sacrifice. Every time a human being doubts the cost of their salvation, they can recall the visible, eternal scars on the hands and side of the glorified King. A testimony to the accuser. They are the eternal proof to Satan that the debt has been paid in full. The scars are my receipt, my signed and sealed covenant with humanity. The accuser has no further claim. An assurance to the doubter, the Thomas principle. They are the physical evidence that allows faith to rest on fact. The Church's claim is unique. Our faith is rooted in an empty tomb and a scarred, risen Lord. Thomas's touch transformed the subjective experience of the disciples into a forensic truth for the world. My submission to Thomas's doubt was an act of profound love for all future generations who would face doubt in the age of science and skepticism. I provided the counter-evidence to every charge of fabrication. Do you demand to see the wounds of Christ in your own life, the tangible evidence that his sacrifice applies to your suffering? The scars are eternal. If the physical proof of the resurrection solidifies your conviction, share this narrative. Let the world know that our faith is founded on facts. Before you continue, make sure you are subscribed. The final chapter reveals the blessing reserved for those who believe without seeing. After Thomas confessed, I delivered the ultimate statement on the nature of faith, a blessing reserved not for those who saw, but for those who would believe through the testimony of others. I said, "Thomas, because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." John 20:29. This was not a rebuke of Thomas. It was the elevation of the future believer. I was establishing the principle that after the final appearance, the greatest faith would be demonstrated by those who trust the witness of the Word and the testimony of the Spirit without requiring physical touch. The function of the original apostles was to see and touch, so that the function of the future church could be to believe and testify. Thomas's physical proof was the necessary bridge between the two ages of faith. He used his eyes and hands to establish the reality that would be received by the hearts of billions who came after him. The Thomas principle is this: faith is not the absence of evidence. It is the submission to sufficient, credible testimony. Thomas's testimony is your evidence. My blessing is your reward for accepting it. The true resolution of Thomas's doubt was not merely the touch, but the commission that followed. The disciples, including Thomas, were not left to ponder the scars. They were sent out with the Great Commission to go into all the world and make disciples. Thomas, the man who demanded empirical certainty, went on to become one of the boldest missionaries, taking the gospel far into the East, traditionally establishing the church in India, a journey that was utterly impossible for a skeptic or a coward. His demand for evidence led not to inactivity, but to unprecedented obedience. The final lesson is that doubt, when brought honestly to the Master, is not condemned, but consecrated. The deepest doubt, when surrendered, produces the strongest faith and the boldest witness. The real reason Thomas needed to touch me was so that his loyalty, once rooted in the physical life of his Master, could be reborn as an eternal conviction in the power of the resurrected Christ, a conviction that would take him to the ends of the earth. Have you been crippled by doubt, believing it disqualifies you from serving the Lord? Thomas's story proves that honest doubt is merely the prelude to deeper worship. Subscribe now and step into the power of the Thomas Principle, transforming your skepticism into unstoppable conviction and your uncertainty into bold witness.